good to be back after the weekend I spent in Altamont. I got to visit with some family, and I got to speak on the work in India over there. This morning we're going to resume our Luke series in the Gospel of Luke, and we'll be looking at Luke chapter 6 and 7. We did not finish chapter 6 last time, which was Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, where Jesus talked about discipleship and what it means to be a true disciple. In chapter 6, we looked at how really the two main things that Jesus tries to bring across are first, that true disciples must be merciful to those around them, and the depth of this mercy extends even towards loving one's enemies, even towards doing nice things for people that aren't quite so nice to you. In fact, the point is not treat others the way they treat you, but treat others the way you want them to treat you. A lot of people in the world like to think of themselves as good people. But in reality, you are not a good person if you simply love those who love you in return, because even wicked people know how to do that. Even the scum of the earth knows how to, reciprocate love, unless they're really bad. No, he says, if you lend to those you expect to receive back from, if you love those who love you in return, well, you're not really doing any great thing. You haven't accomplished anything that would be considered, meaningful. You have simply done what is required of you. You have done the bare minimum. No, he says, love your enemies. Do good and lend expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. For he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men. And so true discipleship is ultimately manifested in imitating the one whom we are disciples of. Being a disciple of Jesus means that we are going to imitate Jesus, who does good even to those who are cruel to him, who begged forgiveness even as they were nailing him to the cross, who died for us even though we were yet sinners in his sight. But the other side of this, besides being merciful, is that disciples should not be hypocrites. Now, this is the difficult thing. It's easy to spot the faults in others. It's easy to look at people we know and say, well, look, here's an instance where you have not shown mercy. Or here's an instance where you have not shown mercy. Well, look, here's an opportunity that you missed. But it is so much more difficult to see the flaws in ourselves, to see the mistakes in our own lives. It is far more difficult for me to find the problems in my own existence than to find the problems in everybody else's existence. Unfortunately, that is precisely what Jesus requires that we do. In verse 39, he spoke a parable to them that a blind man cannot guide a blind man, can he? Will they not both fall into a pit? A pupil is not above his teacher, but everyone after he has been fully trained will be like his teacher. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, and you yourselves do not see the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye. For there is no good tree which produces bad fruit, nor, on the other hand, a bad tree which produces good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. Men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they pick grapes from a briar bush. The good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good. The evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth what is evil, for his mouth speaks from that which fills his heart. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and acts on them, I will show you whom he is like. He's like a man building a house who dug deep and laid a foundation on the rock. And when a flood occurred, the torrent burst against that house and could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who had heard and had not acted accordingly is like a man who built a house on the ground without any foundation. And the torrent burst against it, and immediately it collapsed, and the ruin of that house was great. And this is, of course, really an extension of what it means to be merciful. Because being merciful towards others, it necessitates that we, in some sense, we overlook their flaws. We treat others the way we want them to treat us, meaning, of course, that we don't point out their flaws by being all the while ignorant and not paying attention to our own. If we're going to be merciful towards people, well, it means we must reject the world's mentality of tit for tat. We must reject the world's mentality of simply grabbing all the gusto you can get because you only go around once in life after all. We must reject the world's mentality that says, hold on to your stuff. Get what's yours. Get what you deserve. You deserve all of these nice things, and you shouldn't let people push you around. Well, that's the worldly thinking. And yet I have heard Christians talking that very way, speaking as if that were the very reality which defined our existence, as if that was not simply something to be argued for, but something to be assumed by people of God. That is not the way Jesus thought, and that is not the way that Jesus calls on his disciples to think. No. The world says, don't be nice to people. Those people over there, they weren't nice to you in the first place, so you don't have to be nice to them. That's not what Jesus taught. That's what the world teaches. Don't help those people over there. They wouldn't help you if you were in the same situation. That may be true, but that's not what Jesus taught. Why would we trust the world's way of thinking so much? Why would we trust what the world has to say is wisdom? I mean, since when do they know anything, when you think about it? Trusting worldly thinking is like letting a blind man lead a blind man. It is like saying, oh yeah, here, let me help you, show you where I'm going. I can't see where I'm going either, but, that's okay. We'll get lost together. And what will happen? Well, they're both going to fall into a pit, is what will happen. The disciples of Christ have no business borrowing from the worldly wisdom. No business intermingling worldly thinking with the thinking that Christ espouses, because such thinking is mutually incompatible with what the world thinks. We have no business participating in some kind of Christian worldliness, some kind of syncretized idea that is intermingled with those things. No, if we claim to follow Christ, in verse 40, we must strive to be like our teacher, strive to demonstrate his mercy in all situations. Well, that's painful, because, I look at my own life, and, sometimes I'm not so merciful to others. Sometimes I'm a little more harsh or judgmental or critical. Sometimes I'm a little less accepting of what people have to put forth. Sometimes I set standards for others that are higher than the one that I have allowed for myself. And that's hypocritical, and that needs to change, certainly. If we claim to follow Christ, we should strive to be like our teacher. We will never be above our teacher, in the same way that a disciple is not above his teacher. But if we thoroughly train ourselves, we can become more like our teacher. That is a goal to strive for. In verses 41 and 42, it talks about how easy it is to see faults in others. Oh, look at that. He's got a speck of sawdust in his eye over there. He's got a speck of sawdust in his eye over there. Jesus assumes that you're even talking to the person with the flaw. Probably even worse if you talk about them without them present. How often does that happen? How many sermons are devoted to this idea of, all the other people in the world are wrong, and you're special, and you're better than everybody else? Is that really the way we're supposed to think about that? Well, that kind of preaching is certainly very ear-tickling and very, ego-stroking, but it's not the kind of preaching that the Bible, again, calls on us to espouse. Let's talk about what's wrong. Let's talk about everybody else's problems and pat ourselves on the back for how wonderful we are, all the while not seeing the huge hypocritical log that's coming out of our own eye. No. When the gospel demands change within self, I'm going to go out and force other people to change. I'm going to change my heart. I'm going to change my existence. And then I'm going to share that change I've gone through with other people. I'm going to share the fact that Jesus has, in fact, changed my entire life, my entire worldview, my way of thinking about things. The love of Christ ought to compel us to that kind of message right there. There's an inconsistency in seeing faults in others, because truthfully, to you, your fault is a log. But so often, we want to think our fault is the speck and their fault's the log, and we want to pull the log out of their eye. No, their fault's the speck and your fault is the log. It's always that way. The problem in your life is a bigger issue to deal with than the problem in somebody else's life. The sin in your life is the thing that you need to be more worried about than the sin in somebody else's life. That doesn't mean there's never an occasion to talk to somebody or to rebuke somebody or to deal with somebody. That's not what we're talking about here. But too often what really goes on is that we're far more tolerant of our own shortcomings, far more tolerant of our own problems than we are of those of other people. We're far more willing to look down our noses at those who are living wickedly than we are to look down our noses at our own wickedness, see our flaws for what it is. And perhaps if we applied the same standard to ourselves that we applied to others, we would be more apt to change and to repent. And I'm not speaking to single people out, nor am I speaking to really project myself. Rather, I'm speaking that this is the human condition. This is the way people are. And And this is the thing that needs to change about human existence. And Jesus espouses this idea. If you want to be a disciple of mine, start by working on yourself. You want to have a good marriage? Don't fix your spouse. Fix you. You want to have a good relationship with your children? You want to raise your children right? Well, don't spend your time fixing your children. Fix yourself. The biggest problem in every relationship is you. There's actually a motivational poster on the internet about that. Dysfunction. The only consistent feature in every dissatisfying relationship you have is you. How many people have you met like that? Some preachers, they bounce from church to church to church, and it's always, that one had this problem, that one had this problem, that one had this problem. Well, maybe the problem was you all along. Some churches go through preacher after preacher after preacher. Well, he had this problem, he had this problem, he did this, and he did that, and he did it. Maybe the problem was you all along. And if you're having bad encounters in every relationship with people that you have, maybe the problem isn't them. Maybe it's you. In fact, almost always we'd be better off assuming from the start that it was your fault, working on you, seeing what you could do better, seeing what you could reflect on. It's not your job to lay the blame at other people's feet while making yourself out to be a saint. No, it's your job to get the log out of your eye and to get the speck, and then, only then, will you see clearly to remove the speck in your brother's eye. When you've sorted out your logs, then you can start worrying about other people's specks. I have a lot of logs to worry about, so I'll let you know when I'm done with them. It'll take a while. I'm sure that that would be the case for all of us. He talks about trees and fruits. How do you know when people are good? How do you know that people are good? I remark a lot that I really don't believe in good people because we've all sinned. None is righteous, not even one. But we're talking about the difference between a person who is good and a person who is bad. You look at the fruit they produce. You look at what they do. You look at what they say. You look at the stuff that comes out of their heart. Oh, well, I know I did this really bad thing over here, and I said this really bad thing over here, but you can't know my heart. Actually, you can, because you revealed your heart by what you did and what you said. There is no such thing as a person with a good heart that repeatedly does bad things and says bad things to people. Jesus says the good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good, and vice versa. The bad man, the evil man, out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil. His mouth speaks from that which fills his heart. What makes somebody a good person or a bad person? It's not about what they eat or drink. It's not about the specific external things that they choose to conduct themselves, like the clothes they choose to put on their body or things like that. What makes a person evil is what they say and what they do, how they make their decisions, what their motivation is for things. If somebody has a good heart, it'll show. If somebody has a bad heart, that'll show too. I had a friend who remarked to me once that Jesus says you'll know the tree by their fruits. But too often what happens is people, they do it the other way, don't they? They judge the fruit by the tree it comes off of. They decide ahead of time that, this guy, he's an upstanding, good moral citizen, and, he did this thing over here that's questionable. Maybe it's not so questionable after all. No. Instead of looking at the tree and judging the fruit by the tree, you need to do it the other way around. Or some people are the other way. They've judged a person to be bad. Nothing he'll do will ever be right in their sight. He tries to do good for them, and they're just, they're going to ignore everything he has to say. Anything he does has to be criticized and scrutinized. Well, you're judging the fruit based on an assumption about the tree. Well, those are false ideas. The tree is known by its fruit. You don't want to get those two things backwards. There's an inconsistency in seeing faults in others. People's character is obvious by what they do. That actually sounds kind of judgmental, coming from the guy who a few verses earlier said, don't judge. Which implies that, it's not about simply not judging. It is about, judging with righteous judgment, ultimately. And finally, we come to another problem of hypocrisy. People who say, Jesus is Lord, and then they proceed to not do anything he says. Yeah. We could talk about that a long time, Some people pride themselves in a name they put on the sign of their church building, Church of Christ. But the name on the sign doesn't matter. What matters is what's going on inside. What the group that's being identified, who you are, is far more important than what you call yourselves. You can call him Lord, Lord, until the cows come home. But unless, you're actually doing what he says, then that Lord, Lord means nothing. That profession of Christ means nothing. That claim that you wear the name of Christ means absolutely nothing if you do not actually live like he is the Lord of your life. If you claim to follow Christ, you must reflect his character. You must do what he says. And some people, they come to Jesus and they hear his words, and then they go away and they remain exactly the same as they were. Oh, well, wasn't that exciting? We got to hear Jesus today. I feel so good inside. But they feel, I hope this brother over here was listening because, Jesus had some things to say to him. No time for personal reflection, of course. What is the real issue? What is that man like? Well, Jesus contrasts, two builders. He, that's not worded exactly the same way as it is in Matthew 7, but, you have the wise man. He builds his house on a sure foundation. And the flood comes. He's been stabilized because he's been hearing what Jesus says, because he's been fortifying his life, because he's been changing who he is to fit that solid foundation of Jesus' words. But there's another guy who builds with a poor foundation, who builds, as we might say at a beach house, I guess. And then hurricane season comes and it destroys everything that he has made. He didn't bother to listen to the words of Jesus. He didn't bother to listen to the statement. Your foundation, your very basis for understanding things is flawed. You need to change. You need to fortify yourself. You need to shore up. Batten down the hatches. I often joke, we're all in trouble here in Florida because, Florida has terrible foundations for everything. So we build houses in Florida, we're all foolish, I guess, but, that's the... you can see the foundation settling, cracks forming in the walls and everything like that. But in reality, the real issue here is, of course, not where you choose to build your house, but where you choose to set your life up, what you choose to base your life on. What is the basis on which you make your decisions? You make decisions based on what's going to help you the most, improve your life the most, improve your well-being the most, accomplish your dreams, your satisfaction, your personal ambition? Or do we make decisions based on what Christ would have us do? We make decisions based on the example of selfless, sacrificial, suffering service on behalf of others. Well, that's a very different kind of life that you're proposing to live. It's a life that isn't always lived for self. It's a life that frequently forsakes ambitions in exchange for doing the right thing. Have mercy and don't be a hypocrite. And we want to have treasure in heaven. We don't want to have a ruined house. As we keep reading, we get to we get to Luke chapter 7. So I'm used to this being in Matthew. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus performs a couple more miracles. I'm going to read verses 1 through 17. And both of these sections begin with what we have here is a miracle, and very similar to some of the miracles about the nature of the kingdom that we saw in chapter 4. The first one, the first 10 verses, is about the centurion's servant. When he had completed all his discourse in the hearing of the people, he went to Capernaum. And a centurion's slave, who was highly regarded by him, was sick and about to die. And when he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come and save the life of his slave. When they came to Jesus, they earnestly implored him, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built our synagogue." Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes. To my slave, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he marveled at him. He turned and said to the crowd that was following him, "I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. What do we see here? The centurion is a Gentile. Now, Gentiles were not normally well respected by Jews. The Jews believed they were the one true people of God. They were special. And, the outsiders, they're not going to be part of our kingdom. But the text here specifies that this centurion's a little different. The Jews like him They thought he was worthy. He even helped build their synagogue, apparently. So they say, well, Jesus, you can make an exception for this guy. You can help him out. The centurion is concerned for his servant. Interesting, in reflection of his character, how you were concerned with those below you. But Jesus can't get to his house. Jesus goes to his house. He's on his way there, and then he's stopped. He said, don't come here anymore. The centurion says, don't come to my house. Why not? Because unlike the Jews who thought he was worthy, the centurion says, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. Instead, he says, Jesus, all you have to do is speak the word, and the servant will be healed. Now that's interesting. This guy's, as far as we know, this guy's never met Jesus. All he's done is he's heard about Jesus. He's heard about the things that Jesus has done, the miracles he's performed, the power he has demonstrated. And based on his own understanding of authority, he recognizes Jesus isn't like everybody else. He has authority. He has the power. Authority is basically, it is a right. It is a power. The ability to say something and expect it to be done when you say it. When a person with authority says something, that is the end of a discussion. Unfortunately, I think our society has lost sight of this idea. We don't want to appeal to authority anymore. But truly, there is an ultimate authority that rules over all things. One by whom his very words, the heavens were created and the stars were breathed out of his mouth. And that is the Lord God, who made everything by speaking it into existence. There is a final authority. There is a final one that we call Lord. And here the centurion acknowledges, I understand how this works. He says, I have men under me that I command. And when I say go, that's the end of the discussion. When I say come, that's the end of the discussion. When I say do this thing, that is the end of the discussion. He does it. He obeys the first time. That's how authority works. What about Jesus? Well, he understands Jesus too. Basing everything on his authority. In verse 32 of chapter 4, everyone was amazed that Jesus is teaching in the synagogue because he wasn't teaching like one of the scribes. His message was one with authority. And in that same scene at the synagogue, Jesus rebukes an unclean spirit, and it comes out of a man. And amazement comes on everybody, and they begin talking with one another and say, what is this message? For with authority and power he commands the unclean spirits, and they come out. They do what he says because he has authority. It says something, and I hadn't originally intended to connect this to chapter 6, but it definitely connects to this idea in verse 46 of chapter 6. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? Why would you call Jesus your master and not respect his authority, his absolute lordship over everything that is in your existence? Why would you say, well, I feel maybe I'll recognize Jesus as Lord one day of the week, or maybe two if I feel like coming to a midweek assembly or something like that. But the rest of my life, the rest of my existence, I feel like being my own master. I feel like being my own Lord. I feel like being my own person. Is he really Lord of your life, or is he just Lord of your Sundays? Because that's not really Lord of your life if that's the case. Okay? The centurion here recognizes Jesus has authority over disease. All he needs to do is speak, and it is done. He doesn't engage in some kind of shamanic pagan ritual. He is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He came to set up a kingdom which would never be destroyed. He doesn't need, and here's the real kicker, he doesn't need to be physically present for his will to be done. Or what if Jesus showed up in an assembly like this? There'd be a lot more attentiveness. There'd be a lot more focus. There'd be a lot more interest in what he had to say. But does he need to be physically present for that to take place? For people to recognize him as Lord and Master? No. Jesus, in verse 9, Jesus is amazed at this. Apparently, you're doing pretty good when you've impressed Jesus. He says that not even in Israel have I found such great faith. As opposed to chapter 4, where he didn't even have honor in his own hometown. Here Jesus commends this Gentile, this pagan, this outsider, because he has more faith than all the people I've been preaching to thus far. He finds the greatest honor and the greatest trust in a Gentile military commander. That's incredible. But what's the point? What's the point of the story? It's another illustration of what the kingdom is really about. It's not something that requires Jesus' physical presence in order to function any more than a miracle requires Jesus' presence in order to happen. The kingdom is not something that is going to be subjected to a geographical limitation. Rather, the kingdom is wholly and entirely subjected to Jesus' authority. He speaks and something is done. It is not based on his physical presence, but on spiritual principle. The story also illustrates that Gentiles do benefit from the power of God. The implications of Jesus' words seems to be that the Gentile is actually more primed to accept the Messiah than some of the Jewish people were at that time. They have all these, and you think about it, they have all these expectations. They have all these ideas about what they think the kingdom's going to be like, what they think the Messiah is going to be like, what they think the Spirit's going to be like. And they've allowed these expectations to cloud their minds to the truth. They've allowed past experience to rule their understanding of reality. But this centurion, who probably knows very little of the Scripture and little of the promises, recognizes something. Jesus is Lord. Whatever he says is done. He is most primed to be that disciple of chapter 6. Because he calls him Lord, Lord. And he's ready to do what he says. And he recognizes that what he says will be done. Another miracle, verses 11 through 17. And this one is unique to the Gospel of Luke. Soon afterwards, he went to a city called Nain, and his disciples were going along with him, accompanied by a large crowd. And as he approached the gate of the city, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a sizable crowd from the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he felt compassion for her. And he said to her, "Do not weep." He came up and touched the coffin. The bearers came to a halt, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Fear gripped them all, and they began glorifying God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." This report concerning him went out all over Judea and all the surrounding district. Now, I'm kind of surprised this one's unique to Luke, because this is a resurrection story. You would think that bringing people back from the dead would get a little more press than that. But, this guy's being carried out of the city in a funeral procession, and funerals in their culture weren't like ours. In ancient world, they would typically bury people the same day they died. So this guy's just freshly dead, and they're carrying him out to bury him. They didn't plan a visitation and a funeral for the next available weekend or whatever. This is how they did things back then. And they get a large crowd, and the large crowd is mentioned a couple times in verse 11 and verse 12. And a large crowd means a lot of witnesses. This widow is destitute. First of all, she's a widow, which means she has no husband and no means of financial support there. Second, this is her only son. He can't work to support her anymore because he's dead. What is she going to do? Life is certainly facing a hard economic prospect at this point. But Jesus says, "Don't weep." And he orders the dead man to rise. Now, you do that at a normal funeral, that probably wouldn't be considered in good taste normally. But yet, this is another demonstration of his authority. If it was hard to tell the paralytic man to get up and take up your bed and walk, how much harder is it to tell a dead man, "Get out and speak to us"? And yet the dead man gets up and does exactly that. He starts speaking. And the crowd reacts, and they're struck with fear, and they glorify God because they recognize that God has visited them. What if you had been there? Would that change your life? Watching someone raise the dead, that might strike awe and wonder and reverence into the hearts of all who see. That report certainly goes out everywhere. But what's the point? This miracle is really public, and yet Luke is the only one who records it. Now, Luke later records the raising of Jairus' daughter, another instance where Jesus raises the dead. And that one they kind of suppress a little bit. Jesus only lets 3 of his disciples see it. He tells the family, "Don't tell anybody, keep this hush-hush." As opposed to the other healing where, the man is raised from the dead publicly. John later records the raising of Lazarus, and as far as we know, those are the 3 main instances where Jesus raises dead people during his ministry. But raising of Lazarus, again, very public, and the response to that, of course, was, let's conspire to kill him so that people don't follow him. Seems like a natural reaction to somebody that raises dead people. But if you had been there in that crowd when Jesus rose the dead, would you have been gripped with fear like they were? Well, I probably would have, and you probably would have too. Would that have changed your life? Oh, well, if only we could see more people rise from the dead today. Wouldn't that change everything, right? Well, wouldn't that would surely strengthen our faith and make us better people? Well, no, it wouldn't. A mob and a crowd that witnessed so many wonderful things that Jesus did, that witnessed people rising from the dead. That same mob appears later, yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." And they put to death the Prince of Life. Why? The disciples even scatter. The disciples who watched Jesus perform all of these miracles, who understood the power and the authority of their teacher, who understood that he was the Christ, the Son of the living God, even they flee, not expecting their life-giving teacher to rise from the dead. It's like the rich man's argument with Abraham. In Luke chapter 16, there's a rich man having an argument with Abraham, and he says, "Oh, send Lazarus back from the dead. We'll go talk to them and get my brothers out of this situation so they don't come down to the place of torment where I am." Abraham said, "Well, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them." He says, "But no, Father Abraham. If someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." But he said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead. The people are so hard of heart, they will not listen, even if they see the most wondrous things there are. Like Israel at Mount Sinai before, who saw the great glory of God manifested on the mountain, and then built an idol 40 days later, in spite of the fact that a booming voice from heaven told them not to do that." How permanent is our all, really, when you think about it? The resurrection of Jesus, I believe the resurrection of Jesus is the most powerful, solid argument for the existence of God, for the authority of the Bible, for everything else. I freely admit to people, I believe the Bible because Jesus said it was the Word of God and because He rose from the dead. But not everybody's convinced by that. And I'm just kind of scratching my head and trying to figure out why, and it hit me recently. Not everyone, not even people who grant the resurrection for the sake of argument would believe. Why? Because when Jesus rose from the dead, his religious claims transcended a mere realm of ethical teachings and philosophy and brought us into a real-world concrete context. Now it means something. Now you have to change your life. Now it's not just subjective anymore. Now we've got hard evidence. Now people are forced to make a choice. Do we accept the resurrection? Do we accept life from the dead and thus put ourselves to death so that we might have new life? Or do we reject it in spite of all evidence? Because the implications are too great. Because we don't want to submit to authority. Because we really don't want to call Him Lord. The way you answer that question says everything about who you are. It's not a question of... At some point it ceases to be a question of evidence and starts to become a question of the heart instead. And where is our heart really? Are we willing to accept Jesus as the Lord, as Master? Are we willing to put ourselves to death, dying with Christ, so that we can be risen with Christ, to walk in newness of life, to set our mind on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God, as a mere foretaste of a greater resurrection from the dead to come? Perhaps you're here this morning. Perhaps you've never died with Christ in baptism. Perhaps your death with Christ, you're realizing, wasn't really the death that you thought it was. Perhaps you've resuscitated your old life in an effort to further advance your self-interest. Perhaps it's somewhere along the way you lost your way. And while you profess to call Him Lord, you realize that you are not really living as if He were the Lord of your life. I invite you this morning to consider these things and consider whether you need to make any changes. And if there's anything we can do to help, let it be known. While we stand and while we sing.